Hello and good evening. My name is Charlotte Potter-Kasich, and I am the Executive Director here at the Berry Art Museum. We're delighted to have you this evening for this evening's presentation. So who's the Berry Art Museum? We opened our doors in the fall of 2018. It houses the personal collection of Dick and Carolyn Berry. We have biennial rotating exhibitions and lots of new acquisitions to check out. Our museum serves as one of the many cultural icons of Norfolk, Virginia, and sits as the gateway to Old Dominion University. First, I want to talk a little bit about our collection. What do we have? What do we house? We have three primary collecting purviews. The first is painting. So you'll see everything from maritime to still lives by people like Alfred Maurer. It's an incredible collection that spans a lot of material, from the American modernists to contemporary times. We also specialize in glass sculpture with incredible pieces like this piece by Monier Farmanian. It's just a spectacular artwork that dazzles and references architecture, history, culture. And then we have an entire gallery dedicated to dolls, historic dolls, as well as automata, which we'll get a little bit into this evening. We just reopened a brand new reimagining of our doll gallery, and we invite you to come check it out in person. Soon there'll be 3D virtual tours. We've completely revamped the way that you think about dolls. So we have one wonderful changing exhibition that just opened this week called Rhonda Holybear, Artist and Storykeeper. She is a Lakota contemporary artist with incredible glass beadwork, and that is housed within the doll gallery. We also have a changing exhibition. This will be for thousands of years by local artist Heather Beardsley, who is looking at the Soviet landscape throughout Eastern Europe. And then this evening, we're really here to unpack an exhibit called Motion Emotion, exploring affect from automata to robots. This particular show is really stunning. It thinks a little bit about the history of robots, these original sort of quirky looking figures with these mechanical motions, and then how they really predated modern day robots. We had a robust exhibition advisory board that helped us unpack and really think about the ways in which robotics are exercised here on the ODU campus. And that's how we got to know our speakers here this evening. Both of them served on this exhibition advisory board, and both of them are incredible experts in their own right on different topics relating to robots, robot ethics, as well as engineering. This evening's dialogue between Dr. Yvette Pearson and Dr. Yiannis Papelis will examine the ethical issues related to the design, development, and deployment of police and military robots. Being that we're housed here in Hampton Roads with such a large military presence, we do have in our exhibit some examples of both military and medical applications of robots that have been developed right here on our campus. Through this conversation, we'll identify and examine key ethical issues related to the use of robots for surveillance, reconnaissance, weapons, disposal, deactivation, searches, arrests, detention, training, and combat. We will consider questions such as, how are robots different from cars or tools? Will the use of police and military robots reduce injuries and fatalities? Or will their use make war more humane or even prevent war crimes? Will their use in policing enhance the safety of both the citizens and the police officers? And how do we prevent military or police robots from reinforcing some problematic biases and corresponding social inequities? Who should be held accountable for the actions of robots in these contexts? There's a lot of really big questions here. So let me tell you a little bit more about our panelists. Yvette Pearson, PhD, is a professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Old Dominion University here in Norfolk, Virginia, where she's taught for over 20 years. Her areas of research include robot ethics, crisis management ethics, and bioethics. She's an associate editor for Science and Engineering Ethics in the Online Ethics Center, and a co-author of Crisis Management and Crisis Communication, an Ethical Approach. She has also published multiple co-authored articles and book chapters on ethical issues emerging from the design and use of robots. And then we have Yiannis Papelis, researcher and professor at VMask. Yiannis Papelis is a research professor at Old Dominion University. Before joining ODU, his research focused on high-fidelity driving simulators and studying advanced automotive technologies. and in-vehicle devices. His research on the effectiveness of these was referenced by the Department of Transportation when making its use mandatory in all passenger vehicles built after 2012. His current research interests include ground and maritime unmanned autonomous systems and robotics autonomy, and behavioral modeling, simulation, and immersive VR. Over the course of this conversation, you might have questions. We encourage you to pop those into the Q&A chat. We will tackle them all at the end of the discussion. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce and invite Yvette and Yiannis to turn on their videos and join me. Something that was really, I think, perhaps unusual about this exhibit, if you get a chance to check it out, is it's not just historical artwork or even contemporary artwork, but there's these other industrial applications that both of you have helped us consider. And we're really honored to have you both here today to have this discussion, because I feel like when we were in those exhibition advisory board meetings, there were these really fun conversations sparked between you two in a sparring good way. And I'm excited to see more of them ignite this evening. Wonderful, we're both here. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to let you share your screen and I will duck away and let you guys present. And I'll be back in a little bit. And don't forget that Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, guys. We encourage you to pop questions in. Thanks.
Okay, bear with me just a second. Okay. All right. Well, Charlotte, thank you for that wonderful introduction. So as Charlotte pointed out, right, this is an extension of the motion emotion exhibit. And while that sort of captured a wide array of concerns related to robots, tonight's focus will be somewhat narrower, but still plenty of things to talk about. So we'll be talking about robot warriors and robo-cops, and thinking about some of the ethical issues related to the use of robots in those two kinds of contexts. And so I know we'll say a little bit more about this. So we are talking about embodied robots, right? So embodied robots that have sensors that respond to their environment. So we will, touch on things that are more, well, embodied differently in computers, AI systems, but mostly we're focusing on these embodied robots. Now, you see on this introductory slide here, a very famous, probably maybe the most famous robot in the United States, right? The Terminator, right? Which we know is not real. And then we have this cute little camouflage robot that I think is especially frightening because it's so cute and you might walk up to it and think, oh, how adorable. But this also has a lethal weapon on it. So again, we see that having these robots in our environment, right? We relate to robots differently than we might relate to other kinds of machines. And that could be helpful, but it could also be dangerous. So we thought we'd also start this evening to and just mention a couple of news stories, right? So on one side we see a story this was from the New York Times in 2021 about the New York Police Department deploying this experimental police dog in a low-income neighborhood, and this created a lot of controversy, in part because it came on the heels of a lot of police violence, including the George Floyd murder, and people in this low-income area thought, this is the kind of technology you're going to bring into our neighborhood? How about something that helps us? This doesn't seem great. So this is an example of how things can go wrong with bringing policing robots into the picture. On the other hand, we have a story from this week where a bomb disposal and diffusing robot on the other side of the screen was brought in when a passerby noticed an old stick of dynamite lying around near Lake Tahoe in Nevada. And so they brought in this bomb diffusing robot, and it took care of that. It detonated that old stick of dynamite. Nobody was injured. Everyone went home happy. So this is a kind of positive use of robots in a policing setting. So now we're going to turn to military setting. And Yiannis is going to say a little bit about that.
Right. So the use of robots in the military predates the modern military, really. If you think about it, anything that was mechanized, anything to give an edge to the military. What has been scary recently is the fact that a lot of the technologies that can make these robots act more on their own. I don't want to use the term autonomous because it's a very overloaded term, but a lot of these robots nowadays, without having a human being on them, can operate and participate in war activities. And it's become almost a standard. It makes perfect sense if you think about it. So you have anything from, drones. Everybody knows about drones, and they're used for anything from surveillance to monitoring to payload delivery, but also to deliver weapons. You have a lot of ground robots that can be used to sneak up on forces. This interesting one on the upper left, something has been used in Ukraine, where literally you take a very cheap, low-cost robot. In fact, I look at these wheels, and I think one of our robots in the lab has the same wheels as this guy. You can buy them on eBay for $20 each or something like that. But you can put a mine on it. You can have somebody drive it under a tank and blow it up. And so you basically have a $200 piece of equipment defeat hundreds of thousands of dollars of piece of equipment. This is not, again, what's interesting about this, and we see this a lot in the war in Ukraine, it's not really that much of advanced technology. A lot of warriors there, they literally use the kinds of drones that you buy at Walmart. They hook up a little grenade on it and they fly it in the same way that kids fly drones. They go find a tank and they drop the grenade in the tank. And if you spend a little bit of searching time, you can find videos like this. So again, the whole idea of being able to use these teleoperated robots is a force multiplier. It's very important, and because of it, it will only get more and more commonly used. On the right side of the screen, you have something a little more advanced. The ship at the top is one that actually carries a lot of small unmanned boats. The ship on the right bottom, it's actually a boat. It's a common platform for autonomy. The US Navy uses them. There's no person on this boat. It completely operates on its own. And one of the things we're going to talk about a little bit later is the difference between something that simply has no person on it, which effectively removes the risk, but it is fully teleoperated. It's no different than a remote control car or remote control airplane. In fact, one of the jokes in the military is that an unmanned system takes more people to run than a manned system. So, if somebody wants to get on an F-18 or whatever, they fly it, it's one pilot and maybe the control tower. You want to take an unmanned drone out and you need about 18 people to fly it. But the point is, none of these people is at risk. So this is not going to be the end of it, clearly. The military is investing heavily. I personally work on unmanned systems and autonomy for the Navy. There's a lot of people doing this kind of work, and it makes sense. So I think a lot of the ethical issues that comes with that are going to only get amplified because technology simply races very, very fast, and it's sometimes the psyche of all of us has a hard time keeping up with it. Technology is very faceless. It will just keep moving forward. So, but this is, the kinds of the stuff that is both exciting and scary at the same time.
All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit more about, these are some of the uses. So we've already mentioned reconnaissance and surveillance. And this is what we find the robots are used for the most, even though that's not as sexy and doesn't get as much attention as some of the other kinds of robots, like the fictional robot that we had on the opening screen. Weapons disposal also, again, in the news, but it was probably nothing that people got super excited about. In the exhibit, if any of you were able to get there, you saw a couple of different kinds of training robots, one specifically for military trainees and one for police trainees, and Yiannis will talk about that in a moment. And then, of course, robots in combat. And this is the one where we tend to hear a lot about it. And there's even a whole movement about stopping killer robots, right? And so the killer robots are the ones that seem to well, and they are scary, frankly. But these are the ones that we hear about the most, but aren't as prevalent, right, as the reconnaissance and surveillance robots. There are also robots that are designed to help with rescue and supply delivery in military settings specifically, but also in other kinds of settings. I know during the pandemic, there were robots in hospitals delivering supplies to the healthcare workers so that they didn't have to be running around quite as much. And then, of course, robots involved in apprehension and detention of suspects or people who are actually convicted. All right, and so we're going to move on now to some potential benefits. So what we're going to talk about here are, you know, claims that have been made, or, you know, potential benefits people have put forth when saying, hey, we should have robots in military and policing, and here's why. So one reason that has been offered is because robotic systems are going to be able to target things more precisely. When we're engaged in battle, we're going to hit the actual target, right? We're going to kill the person who's actually causing the trouble, who's maybe firing artillery at us, and we're not going to blow up the Doctors Without Borders hospital, for instance, and cause a lot of what is sometimes called collateral damage. That's, of course, a euphemism. So this is one of the claims that's made, but I think we're going to hear some counterpoint to that here.
Right. So the counterpoint to this is, you know, unless you're talking about policing, where there is a valid claim to be said about the police generally tries to very heavily avoid collateral damage. When it comes to actual war fighting, precise targeting and less collateral damage is not necessarily independent. A bad actor could literally want to invoke collateral damage in order to make a point. So having more precise targeting could actually be more damaging. If somebody wants to hit the hospital because they want to create you know, mayhem to the opposition, well, they could, as opposed to having less accurate weapons where maybe they can hit the hospital. Now, if they want to target the hospital. So really, I'm not sure that this is a good argument in the sense that the use of robotics and this technology, it simply allows whoever is doing whatever they want to do it better, but it doesn't necessarily make that person do things properly. So, you know, I think there is always a counterpoint to the first one about the collateral damage. It all depends. And war is a messy business, so you can never assume that just because people can be nicer about it, they're going to be nicer. War, by definition, is not a nice interaction.
Right. And yeah, following up on that too, you know, the weapons that we have, right, could of course fall into the hands of the enemy side, and they could do exactly the kinds of things that you were just talking about. I know of at least one, I think it's called Doggo, and there's one that is made to self-destruct if it's captured by an enemy, but not all of them are like that. And so we could end up with things being used against us if we are the people who are engaged in it, let's hope, a just war. So another claim that's been made is that there would be fewer injuries and deaths among the combatants, among the soldiers. Okay, and of course we're thinking of the soldiers on the side that's leveraging the technology, right? And so again, and hopefully, I think people, at least those who make this kind of argument, are hoping that that they will be able to dispatch the enemy, to put it euphemistically. But the idea is that it would be of lower cost in terms of human lives to the side that's using the robot soldiers instead of the human soldiers.
Right. So the flip side of it is that if you find yourself on the other side of the war wall, you'll definitely not have less injuries if your opponent has a lot of this equipment, right? Another thing to factor in is the fact that you know, this technology, we always like to think of it as one side has it, the other side doesn't. Ultimately, what happens is everybody will have it. Maybe there is some advancement that certain sides, you know, may have an advantage in it in volume or in the technology, but it's a matter of time before everybody catches up. So the reality is, if we develop more lethal weapons or more accurate weapons, the likelihood of having fewer soldiers injured is almost self-contradictory. By definition, we're having weapons that are better at killing, so the likelihood of having more soldiers being killed is higher than if we didn't have those weapons. So I think if you think of this from the stand of, okay, we happen to have a tactical advantage now, and in a very short window, our soldiers are going to be better off, then maybe there's a good argument to be made there. But long term, everybody will have those weapons, and it will definitely, war will become more lethal when these weapons are engaged.
Right. Yeah. And there was even an older example that philosopher Chimayo talks about in a book called Drone Theory, where in 1898 there was a conflict between an Anglo-Egyptian force and Sudanese force, and the Anglo-Egyptian force had machine guns. And they lost a total of 48 people while they killed 10,000 people on the other side. So there are some, you know, real reasons to be skeptical of this claim that some make, that it would be overall a lower rate of injury. And also, we can also raise the concern about exacerbating existing injustices, right? Because it's likely that, at least initially, right, even if everybody gets the weapons eventually, at least initially, it's likely to be countries that are already perhaps significantly disadvantaged. So we might be exacerbating injustices that already exist in the world. So to move to the next one, quicker response time is also thought of as being an advantage, right? So it will take, you know, a few millionths of a second for a robotic system to respond. And again, we might think that sounds really great, but I think we can consider advantages to waiting a little bit in some instances, right? And it may be the case that lethal force isn't necessary, right? But if we've already pulled the trigger, then we're kind of at a loss there.
Well, and you know, the response time is interesting. I don't know if anybody is a Star Trek fan. One of the biggest, well, there's many things to find fault with Star Trek, although I love Star Trek, is that the battles are completely unrealistic. Here you have computers that can think very fast, and they're so advanced, and then you have all the ships basically duking it out as if they're like 16th century, you know, boats having cannons where phasers are flying, and then I mean, in reality, if you have advanced technology like this, battles would happen in a millisecond, because by the time you know, the computer can think, launch whatever laser, and the other side will sense it, launch their laser, and this will happen in literally nanoseconds or billions of a second. So yeah, I think there's something to be said about response time. And again, it's all a matter of, do you let the technology take over, or is it simply a tool, at which point response time may not be so much the issue, because we still have humans, we have to make decisions about deploying those weapons. But you know, there's something to be said about if we're gonna launch a bunch of delivery or logistics. By the way, war, 90% of it is logistics. If you have a fleet of automated machinery, it could conceivably be faster to respond, but I don't see that as a big differentiator, really. There's a lot more potential benefits than the response time as well.
All right. So, and this next one about the costs, right? The lower costs we might compare, or at least there was a comparison in terms of the 2015 cost of training a drone pilot, which is about $60,000, at least in 2015. And the cost of training an FA-18F pilot is 9 million, or it was in 2015, and I don't think it's gone down. And so we can imagine someone, saying that, oh, well, look at the cost savings of training drone pilots, right, instead of having a human pilot training. And so again, this might sound appealing, but there are some concerns, of course.
Yeah, I don't know anything that is ever becoming lower cost. As time goes by, the cost of everything increases. So, it will be interesting to see if sometime in the future, I'm being sarcastic here, right? But if sometime in the future the military will come in and say, hey, we're using robots, we want less money now, I don't think that's going to happen. So I don't know about the lower cost part.
Right. Well, yeah. But that might just mean that there are more robots around and all the attending problems that go with those. So,
right. Yeah.
All right. So the next sort of potential benefit is this idea that we wouldn't need lethal force, right? In some cases, or maybe we would need lethal force in fewer cases, right? So if we just have a robot going in to manage a situation, whether in the policing settings or in military settings, the one thing we're not going to worry about is the robot. Even if we don't want our robots destroyed, we are not going to worry about that in the same way that we worry about a person being killed. And so if we're not worried about the robots being, destroyed or something like that, it may be that we don't use lethal force, right? That we just, stun people or capture them in a net and, hold them while we wait for, somebody to come and make a judgment about what should happen. So there is this idea that some have that we might not need the lethal force quite as often. So
yeah, again, war is all about lethal force. There is something to be said about technology being so advanced where nobody messes with you, right? To some degree, this is the approach we take in the United States. Our military is overwhelming. Nobody would dare mess with us head to head. They do try to mess with us in terms of, sideways, different ways, but nobody would, dare take the United States on a head-to-head combat. So I do think there is something to be said about having overwhelming force and being, it's kind of like, being the biggest guy in the bar. Nobody's going to do anything with you. So there is something to be said about it. But again, I think one of the points I made earlier, that it is very rare that you can maintain a significant advantage. If you look through the history of civilization and the war and everything else, civilizations may at some point in time have a tactical and strategic advantage, but time is very brutal. Before you know it, other countries, groups, organizations, players, however you want to refer to them, they will end up having the technology. So that technology is a fair assessment that in time everybody will have it, at which point we're simply upping the stakes of war. We're not necessarily reducing the need for lethal force. So I think, again, we're talking about things that may be true in a very narrow sliver of time where somebody happens to have a tactical advantage, but it always catches up with you.
right, and what you're saying also makes me think about like just another Cold War, right, where we just all have these really powerful weapons, and as you say, the stakes are extremely high. It's just the mutually assured destruction. And as we think about design and deployment of robots, one of the things we want to consider is how far we should allow that to go. Should we really permit something like this zero-sum game where everybody loses in the end? the last item on this slide, this one, some would say that there would be fewer inhumane actions and war crimes. The idea being that robots aren't going to act out of anger or thirst for revenge or sadistically. I'm hoping and assuming that we're not going to program them to act in any of those ways. But the idea is that we wouldn't have some of the awful massacres and other war crimes that we've seen if we use robots instead of human soldiers who are going to act on some really strong and negative emotions toward the enemy.
Well, so there is a question on the Q&A session, which is actually brings up a good point. I don't think we were very accurate in defining what a robot is, right? And so one of the points in the Q&A section is that a robot by definition has to have some autonomy and be able to have independent decision making. And this is very, very futuristic. The reality is we're so far away from this that, again, it's a very popular movie trope. It's a very popular idea that robots are so smart and we can build artificial intelligence and things like that. But unfortunately, and I say this as an engineer, the practical reality is way more mundane than that. So, and despite this though, this is very important to factor in, even if you have a robot that's not necessarily that smarter than, you know, nothing more than an automated system that can track a lane or can, you know, fly semi-autonomously from point A to point B. The way a lot of these issues we're talking about are very applicable because it is something that wasn't available before. We also have seen research that even though an anthropomorphic robot, something that looks like a human being or something that looks like an animal, even though it can be dumb as a box of rocks, it has a very different influence on people than if you simply had a computer with Alexa on it. So, you know, I think in our cases, we're talking about robots as nothing more than mobile mechanisms that have some degree of autonomy, but not necessarily decision making. There is no scenario that I know of at this point, and very few scenarios that people are actively assuming this will be doable in the near future, where we will let a robot take control and make decisions without a human overseeing that. Now, that doesn't mean that people can't do stupid things where, you know, like the Tesla drivers, that because they have effectively what is equivalent to a really good cruise control, they assume that they can take a nap and then, you know, they crash because some reflection from the sun blinded the car, right? So we will always have things like this. But the reality is in the military, and for that matter, in most technological venues right now, there's really no such thing as autonomy that comes even anywhere near the human ability of making decisions. So, but despite that, a lot of the issues we're talking about, I think, are still valid because somehow when you see, and we'll see some pictures, you see a robot that looks like a person, and it's like it's a whole different thing than if you simply had a picture of somebody. So research has shown this again and again and again. So that's a great question, though, and it's very related to what we're talking about.
Right, and I want to follow up too on that that robots they are designed for very specific tasks, right?
Right.
So there's not this general intelligence that some people like to talk about that seems to be prevalent in the Hollywood scenarios. But probably the better word to use is independent. So they have varying degrees of independence, and nothing like autonomy that human beings would typically have, where, you know, human beings, you know, freely choose a specific life path and freely use to adhere to certain values and principles. There are certain roboticists, Ron Arkin at Georgia Tech, for instance, who does think that we can program these capabilities into robots, but so far we can't even agree on what moral principles we would program into robots if we were going to do that. So we're way behind on that. Yeah, that's just to again agree with what was said earlier, and just to note that it's a pretty narrow range of activities that any particular robot or AI system can actually manage. All right, so now we're going to move to talking a little bit about one of the training robots, if I can move, there we go, that is on exhibit at the Barry Art Museum. And since Dr. Papelis is the one that helped develop this, I'll let him talk about it.
Right, so this is a good example of what a typical military robot used for training looks like. The problem here is then when you're doing marksmanship training, you can shoot at your typical targets, you know, the bullseye kind of targets. You can put stationary targets, you have still targets, there's all kinds of things like that. But the reality is it's very hard to capture all the training effects when you have something that moves much like a human being, including the unpredictability of stopping, zigzagging, and so forth. And so a system like this, which is very straightforward to build, it has some limited autonomy, you can follow a particular path, you can try to avoid hitting anything, but you can tell it how fast to go, how to act. You can have several of them be near each other to simulate a group of people. And when they're a mile away from the person who's trying to do the shooting, there's very little difference in what things look like between being real human beings and actually have the robots. So this is a system that is currently in use by various branches of the service with their explicit purpose to train the soldiers on better marksmanship skills. Anything from rank and file, kind of soldiers who basically have to learn how to shoot, down to the more advanced sniper type of training where people make shots a mile away and have to really wait for hours and hours before they can take one shot. So this is an example of it. And again, you look at something like this, and if you see it at the museum, and I work with the system for many years now, and still the first time you see it, you see the torso, you see the bullet holes on it, you see the scrapes. And it's a very different thing than if you simply had a target, like a flat target, even if that flat target was a picture of a human being. So I think it's a good example of how having this three-dimensional anthropomorphic aspect of it not only increases the realism of the training and improves, and also the fact that it moves like a human being in terms of movement, speed, and direction and things like that. But it's also a good example of potentially maybe desensitizing people where you shoot at it and you don't think that you're shooting at somebody, but the reality is this is what you're being trained to do. So if you get a chance to visit the museum, spend a second to look over it. If you haven't, it's probably good reason enough to stop by and see all the cool things that are including this robot that's up there at the museum.
Right, and then when we had an initial introduction to the human type target, one of the questions that came to my mind, again, and thinking about some of the ethical implications, is I wondered, right, if this had any effect on post-traumatic stress in soldiers. For instance, I wondered, one, if it might reduce post-traumatic stress because they had this kind of desensitization. I wondered if it could induce post-traumatic stress because, without actually even going into combat. So these were some questions that popped into my mind, and some concerns. And again, this just is a more broad concern about whether the use of robots or a certain type of human robot interaction is overall going to be beneficial, or is it going to be harmful? And so
yeah, I can tell you one kind of semi-funny story. We go out and these robots have a sensor on them. So when you shoot at them, they know they have been shot. So if you hit them, in fact, sometimes we have a sensor that can even tell if you missed by a little bit, right? But if you hit them, they know they were hit. And one of the things you can do, you can program them. Again, this is not intelligence, it's simply reactions, very, very low intelligence reactions. But one of the things we did, we programmed them to basically go back and forth. But the moment they get shot, they would turn towards a certain direction where we knew the person is shooting at them. And go towards that person at full speed. And no matter how much we are shooting at the robots and we thought nothing of it, there is a very special thing that you feel when you shoot at it and it turns and basically charges at you. You know it's a robot. I know I have a button, I can stop it, but somehow there's this little thing that your heart kind of beats a couple of times faster there for a second when the thing just turns and responds to you. So I know, I mean, I helped build this. I know it's fake. I know it's not real. I know I can stop it. I know I have a button I can press to make it turn. And still there's a fraction of a point there that you kind of go, whoa, wait a second, you know? So yeah, it's hard to describe how something like this has this effect on our psyche. And I think that goes back to this point about, you know, even without autonomy, even without the full intellect, this kind of behavioral similarity to other humans triggers something in us that, again, can be used for good, bad, or anything in between.
Right. Yeah. And I know that some of the scholarship also indicates that even if it's not a humanoid shape, it can also induce these kinds of emotional responses and even attachments. And then we get to concerns about, and I'm going to go to the next slide since we're sort of bleeding into that territory. Right. So I guess we're not really getting into that just yet. Okay. So, all right. So, but there are these broader concerns about attachment to robots and how they elicit certain kinds of emotions from us and what effect that might have on our behavior, including our interaction with other human beings. So, all right. So to move to some ethical concerns specific to military robots, we have. Again, we talked a little bit about more precise targeting. One of the concerns about more precise targeting is this need for increased surveillance, right? If you want to make sure you're getting exactly the right target, right, that's going to mean some increased surveillance of and making some distinctions between what is an appropriate target and what's not an appropriate target, and this raises concerns about privacy. It raises concerns about freedom of movement. Okay, so this is one concern that I think you wanted to respond to.
You know, surveillance is interesting. I don't think we care about surveilling our enemy, right? But at the same time, like we said before, this technology always spills over. And so I do think there's a little bit of a concern, but the way to deal with this, I think, is more in having the proper safeguards rather than trying to hold back the technology, because that's all but impossible. The cat is out of the bag, like they say. Don't forget GPS, a lot of our cellular communications, these are all military technologies, right? You know, so if it weren't for the military trying to kill other people, we wouldn't be able to get directions to find our taco bar. So something to think about.
Right. Yeah. The dual use thing. I mean, again, we have a lot of domestic technologies in addition to the GPS, right, that have come from this, and so we do want to be careful. Again, as we're thinking about what kinds of things we're going to design, right? We hope that everybody who's making the robots and other kinds of technologies is also keeping in mind that they may be used for something other than they were initially used for. And that might be great, and it might be something pretty terrible. All right, so that increased efficiency, which we've brought up before, but there's a concern about it accelerating the pace of combat. Some concern related to that about there being a destabilizing effect. I think that was alluded to earlier. I don't know if you wanted to say more about that one.
I mean, you know, again, I think the issue here is that these are tools, right? And one of my favorite saying is a fool with a tool is still a fool. Well, a dictator with technology is still a dictator. So I think it's all about these are tools, and no matter what we think they're for, there is potential for use and there's potential for abuse. But my point to a lot of this is that this is not unique to robots by any means. So there's nothing special about building a quote unquote smart robot or even a dumb robot. There's no different than building a better tire. It's just a tool that you hope will help your side, but eventually, it has consequences. I like to think of this thing where people talk about, you can't talk to fish about water, right? Because water is so much around them, they don't understand the concept. Now as fish, they're going to understand anyway. But the point is, things that we build and the way technology advances, whether it is for military, whether it is for whatever reason, eventually it becomes an ambient part of our existence. And this is where I think there's a really interesting and dangerous point, because once the technology becomes so part of what we assume is the normal, this is when we lose our ability to understand how it negatively affects us. But again, I think my point is this is not unique to robots. This is to everything. And I don't know that, a lot of these points hold a lot of water purely for robots. They're great questions, they're great topics, but they're no different than, talking about Alexa or talking about search and talking about a bunch of other stuff. And I think we have some examples later on bias and everything else, which again, they're very much a technology issue, and robots are simply leveraging that kind of technology.
All right, so I want to move on here and talk about this specifically in the context of war is of great concern, right? That robots lack this capacity for nuanced moral judgment. If we're thinking about what's required for a war to be considered a just war, for instance, right? That there's a proportionate response and right intention, and that it's a last resort, and so on, that we're discriminating between combatants and non-combatants and using no more than the force that's absolutely necessary. It's unclear, for instance, that robots are going to have the capacity for nuanced moral judgment, that, for instance, we might need to distinguish between a group of surrendering enemy soldiers versus a group of just sort of regular enemy soldiers trying to kill us. So is the robot going to be able to make a nuanced distinction between those kinds of groups? Again, we don't have any reason to think that they could, and so that would at least be a bit of a case against allowing them, or as we are thinking about moving a certain direction in terms of developments and design of robots, should we not move toward increasing the autonomy of the robots, right? Some people, this is a holy grail to make them more and more autonomous, but it may be that is not a particularly good idea, and that even if we do, that they are not the sorts of machines that we put in the context of war, or in a situation where we would be deferring to them in terms of decision making.
Yeah, the technology is not there yet, and I think anybody who would be in a position to make a decision about employing that kind of technology knows that. I think we're very, very far away from accomplishing certainty, or at least some level of technology readiness where we would even consider having anything that this would be an issue, right? I think it's a great conversation to have, making a lot of assumptions that are very much like Star Trek, like I said before, and it sounds ridiculous because I think it is, right? So we can talk about I think we can have conversations about it, assuming a bunch of things that are so far away, technologically speaking, from today, that you might as well be arguing whether Spider-Man or will win a fight against Superman. It's all hypothetical, and we can argue back and forth, but the reality is we're nowhere near the kind of technology necessary to talk about moral judgment in robots. They will do whatever we program them to do, and it is a lot more straightforward than a lot of the popular press may have you believe.
Right. Yeah, and related to that, like there's a lot of the scholarship on this topic will talk about a responsibility gap, but it seems again in agreement with what you were saying, right, that there isn't really a responsibility gap, right? It's either the programmer or the commander, we're talking in a military context, that's responsible. It's not really a big mystery. Certainly morally it's not a big mystery, though I think we can admit that the technology continues to be ahead of the law in many places. And so from a legal standpoint, there may be a gap, but from a moral standpoint, it's pretty clear. And we would treat it just like we treat other kinds of collective moral actions. So, all right, so to move, I'll take those next two kind of together, right? Because those points are about you know, if the cost of war, meaning specifically the human and political costs of war, are lower, we may have more wars, some would say, and more wars could translate to more unjust wars, right? So we might just say, hey, what's the cost, right? We're not going to lose that many people. Maybe it's not even financially going to be that big of an investment. So, you know, maybe we haven't quite met the criteria for a just war, which is a defensive response to unjust aggression, but let's go ahead, you know, let's go ahead and show them who's boss and get out and, you know, and move on. So I don't know if you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, listen, this is more of a, I don't know, semi-political statement, but I think, you know, unless there is a very tight link between people who decide there should be war and cost to them personally, that is always the case, right? Nobody who decides to go to war physically goes to war. They decide to go to war and somebody else goes to war, right? Until that gap becomes the same, you know, I think this is going to be a perpetual problem. And frankly, I don't know that having robotics really makes the war that much cheaper or that much. Again, remember, the whole point of the robots is not to blow up the bridge. Sure, it is to blow up the bridge, but eventually it is to attack your enemy, and that involves potentially killing your enemy. So I think again, this is a topic that transcends robots. It's just a perpetual human failing, if you ask me. The decoupling between people who decide that we should go to war and the people who actually have to fight the war. So.
Yeah, and that relates to the next point about this. There's a concern about the potentially diminished role of human choice and human decision making, right? So if we may become, and this is something that we can talk about outside the context of military robots, but people may become overly reliant on robots or trust the robots more than they trust human beings. And we may have less and less role in making decisions, and that is potentially harmful. We may, if we're inclined to just defer to the robot and let them just, you know, find their target and shoot, even in a case where a human might hesitate, and it might be the right thing to do to hesitate in some kinds of circumstances.
I think what is truly much more dangerous, and to some degree, I think I see this in a lot of places, is actually blaming the robots as a way to take away responsibility. Mm-hmm. We see this a lot. I mean, if anybody has ever called, called some big company online and you're trying to get a solution to your problem, and somebody says, oh, I wish I could help you, my computer won't let me do this. I mean, this is literally passing on responsibility to technology for unwillingness to do something. So I can see some situation where, oh, we blew up the school. What? Yeah, it was damn robots. You know, we didn't want to do it, but the robots decided. I think that is a real risk. That to me is a lot more scary, because the technology is there to do damage, and to the degree that we don't, the degree that the public doesn't have a good understanding about the actual intelligence of the robots, they're more likely to believe that when somebody blames the robots as having making the decision, where in reality, that's not the case. So I actually believe the risk here is lack of public education and awareness of the technology, because it allows the possibility of skirting responsibility by blaming the technology. That to me is very scary.
Mhm. Yeah. All right. So we okay. So we're moving into another one of the robots that was exhibited in the Berry Art Museum. Did you want to play this video?
Let's do really quickly. Yeah.
Okay, that's 30 seconds. Let's see. All right, let me readjust. And okay, so this is a
Oops, we can't hear the audio, guys.
I will go ahead and narrate. This is basically a robot that is meant to look anthropomorphic, and the whole point is to be used to interact with police officers as a way to train officers to deal with challenging situations. So we literally program the robot to do everything wrong when interacting with a police officer: talk back, not comply with instructions, hide their hands behind their back, make threatening moves, all so that the police officer can train to understand the point where the line is between, you know, having to take physical action versus not taking physical action and simply using other tools to de-escalate the situation. Again, this is a good example of anthropomorphic robots used for training. And it's, again, a local company that has done some of this work. I worked on this robot a little bit as well. And it has been used to do some pilot work in seeing whether it can be an effective tool in training officers to deal with challenging situations, especially verbal confrontations.
oops. All right. So this, of course, is a training robot, but we wanted to also at least highlight a few concerns about using robots in policing. Again, some of these overlap with the Reliance, with the concerns in military context, but over-reliance on robots is one problem. We have, you know, some people who have an algorithmic bias, right? So they might think that it's, you know, that we ought to rely on robots. And then there's the related concept a little further down of over-trust in robots, right? And that is where we might assume robots are more capable or more intelligent or less likely to make mistakes. And so with both of these particular problems, there is a concern about de-skilling human workers. But again, the robot that we just saw, this is one that might actually improve human skills. But to the extent that we use robots to take over certain job tasks, it may mean that we're doing jobs in a way that requires less skill than before.
Yeah, I mean, that's true though, but you know, again, this is true of everything. We don't use typewriters anymore, and I think typewriting is a dying skill. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? You know, I look at my daughters, you know, typing with their thumbs on their phones. I can't even, you know, I have to use my big finger to type one character at a time, right? So, you know, I'm behind the times there as well. So I think this falls under the same thing. This is technology going ahead. The world has been using technology to do less of the mundane and less of the repetitive things so we can do other stuff. A lot of the issues here, I think, may have some basis, but again, it's how you use it. The example we brought up is a training thing, right? I have a hard time thinking of any downside to it, in the sense that it will actually, it can improve the interactions. But the dog that you brought up at the beginning, I mean, that was a great example of algorithmic bias or reinforcing existing social injustices, right? You know, we have this scary looking dog. What do? We got this neighbor who tried to scare people with it. I don't think that's how it should work. So yeah, I do think there's something to be said about some of those points. But again, separating what is just technology moving on versus robotic specific issues, the social injustice, algorithmic bias, again, these are valid points, but they're, in a way, they're very linked, right? Reinforcing existing social injustices is literally what algorithmic bias is. You know, we use all of these machine learning models that basically learn by the data we give them. Well, we give them biased data, they're going to become biased robots. The only good thing about it is that when a robot makes a biased decision, we look at it and go, wait a second. It's kind of like seeing your kids swear and you ask them, hey, where'd you hear that word? And say, oh, I heard from you, daddy. You know, like, oh, crap, you know. So maybe this is one of those things where this actually would be a reckoning for us, where we now try to train the robots to become like us, and we see us in somebody else's shoes, and we're like, wait a second, is this how we've been behaving? That's not right. So maybe there is some light at the end of the tunnel. So I want to be optimistic, even though I'm very cynical about this.
Right. Yeah, and I that's one of the things I like about exploring ethical issues related to robots across several domains, is that it does provide a window into human behavior and human nature, right? Because oftentimes we have no problem with people acting in a certain way, or at least we behave as if there's no problem with a certain social institution, but then we say, you know, we put a robot into that setting and we're like, oh wait, what are you doing? What's wrong with that? And this came up in a different context, like the context of using robots as assistive devices for older adults, and people said, oh, what are you putting grandma alone in a room with a robot for? And I'm like, well, you know, we've been leaving grandma alone by herself for decades, so why is it now a problem because we wheel in a robot? So
exactly.
So yeah, so this is and I think when I think of over trust of robots, right, again, because they are these embodied entities that somehow reel us in emotionally, right, we may be inclined, right, some of the research suggests we may be inclined to go along with what they say, even if we've been told otherwise by a human, such as the humans that followed the robot away from the fire exit and toward the smoke, right? Even though they'd been told something to the contrary. Another concern along a similar line relating to that risk of privacy is that some of the research that's been done suggests that if there's a camera present, people will engage in privacy enhancing behaviors. But if they are in the presence of a robot or interacting with a robot, even though that robot also has camera capabilities, right, they do view the robot as sort of a safer kind of thing, right? It's kind of a friend, and so so adults don't engage in privacy enhancing behaviors around robots in the way they would around a camera. And so again, just because of that manifestation of the technology, there are some increased concerns about privacy and certain potentially problematic attachments to them. All right.
So while you're making your way on the next slide, Yvette, I want to touch on another question, since we're wrapping up here on the timing. The issues, could you use a teddy bear for hostage negotiations, right? And the idea is that to the degree that people respond to how a robot looks, it makes sense that we use something that's softer and cuddly in order to negotiate. And to be honest with you, I don't know the answer to that. This to me sounds like the kind of thing where somebody would have to do some actual research to find the answer. We can all have opinions about it, but the reality is, a hostage negotiation, this is not a neutral person. So they may end up being more suspicious of a cuddly bear versus, the big, machine gun welding thing. So I honestly don't know the answer to that. And I think it would take some experimentation to find out.
Okay. All right, well, we had some closing thoughts that we'll put up here. I mean, one thing that I think is important with all of this is to, keep in mind that, there are some potentially problematic outcomes, but they're not necessarily going to obtain in reality, right? We do have control over whether to pursue specific design pathways, whether to use robots in specific ways. So it's not just being foisted upon us, and by us I mean not just the general population, but the people who are designing, developing robots and things like that. So suggestions we have here are maintaining this meaningful engagement in military and policing decisions, right? So that we're not just abdicating our responsibility and freedom in those contexts. Making sure to bring in and consider interests of multiple stakeholders when we're doing the designing and using of robots. And then making sure that we're designing them in ways that are to assist human beings rather than replace us. And obviously, as we've said already, clear communication of functionality limitations. Frank Pasquale in his new laws of robotics, one of his fourth law of robotics is to make sure that AI systems and robots always clearly indicate the identity of their creators, controllers, and owners. So this may be idealistic, but it may be something to aim for as we're putting robots out in the world.
So what you're saying, Yvette, is that if we run into a robot, the first question is from us, we have to be, who's your daddy?
Exactly. Who sent you?
Well, on that note, I guess.
Well, what I love about that is that, Yiannis, you've been making these, and Yvette, you've been critiquing these for so long, and it's really fascinating. All the questions that have come up, you've sort of addressed throughout this. And what I find really interesting about this discussion is that you're really encouraging us not to live in the black and white when it comes to technology. It's not that it's good and it's not that it's bad. It's not that it's going to be able to help or hinder. It's really that there's a lot of questions that need to be asked at every moment along the way. And you've asked so many of these questions in a really good way. Thank you for systematically going through and addressing a lot of the Q&A questions over the course of the talk. There's been a couple that have popped up on a side note. And I think the real one that's at the heart of this entire conversation is, how do we confront human bias influencing the foundation of robotics? And really, it seems like it comes back to that thought of, who's your daddy? Can we differentiate between the maker and the robot itself? And I loved the parallel of seeing your kids parrot what you do, and you didn't even realize that you were modeling terrible behavior until you see it pop up.
And I'm not speaking from experience, I promise.
Oh, no, of course.
Right,
yeah.
of course.
Your kids don't swear.
That's right.
Well, I want to thank you both so much. This has been fascinating, and my only regret is that we didn't have this talk earlier in the exhibition run, because I think it's unpacked a lot for me that has sort of gone unsaid a little bit within the exhibit. Everybody just must go and check it out. There's been links that have been popped into the conversation throughout. So I hope you guys, even if you don't live locally, take a minute to check it out virtually. Everyone, please join me in thanking Yvette and Yiannis in this wonderful evening. And I'm just gonna do a couple outtakes here. All of this was strategic, my friends, because we have something called Mars Fest that's coming up. It's October 14th, 15th, and 16th. And during this particular festival, it's free and open to the public. We're thinking a lot about how robotics has been so influential and important in space exploration. And some of the ethical considerations there, are they going to be companions to astronauts so they don't lose it when they try to travel for 3 years to Mars? So there's some really interesting conversations that will be had here, also to do with robotics. We are welcoming our friends from NASA we want to champion the work that they're trying to do with their Artemis mission, and we hope that they all get to send off tomorrow. And we're sorry that they got delayed on Monday. So join us. I hope that you guys can come to that. Some other free programs coming up. We have tours every Saturday at 1 p.m. They're free. And then we also have our Unite series, which is the second Friday of every month. It's free and open to the public. Check it out. The next one coming up is just next Friday, September 9th. And it's featuring the work of Heather Beardsley, and it's thinking about sustainability. And we're welcoming a lot of wonderful community partners like the Elizabeth River Project to talk about sustainability in our community. We also are launching Monarch Makes, which is a free hands-on activity from 2 to 4 every Saturday. And we have some awesome upcoming lectures. Let's see here. So in October, we have Morgan Gendel, who is talking about Mars as an outpost or a new Airbnb. In November, we have Rhonda Holybear talking about how she makes with her meticulous glass beads. In December, we're inviting Susie Peck and Michael Stern, who will be talking about glass and technology. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I hope that you will come to the Barry Art Museum and have a wonderful evening. Thanks.